Hello and welcome to Maiden, Matriarch with me, Louise. My guest today is Catherine Pakaluk, Director of Social Research at the Catholic University of America and the author of a brand new book called Hannah's Children, The Women Quietly Defying the Dearth. The book contains interviews with 55 American women who have both been to university, are educated, and have also had 5 or more children, i.e. women who are very, very unusual because, as I discussed with Catherine at the beginning, education seems to correlate with women having fewer children. So the big question is, why are these women defying that trend? And we spent the episode talking about exactly that, what these women have in common, how they understand childbearing, what sacrifices they're willing to make in order to have a big family. In the extended part of the episode, we spoke about Catherine's own large family and why she thinks that the kind of pronatalist policy that focuses on economic tweaks to policy is not going to work. This isn't an economic question. This is something completely different. That extended version of the episode is available at louiseperry.substack.com, where, as always, you can find the whole back catalogue of extended episodes, the MMM chat community, and also the bonus episodes that I do fortnightly with my husband. Enjoy. Many of you will know that Christianity is a subject of fascination for me, and the role of Christianity in shaping the modern world is a theme I return to again and again on the podcast. My view is that we really can't understand the world or ourselves without getting to grips with it, which is why I'm very glad to point you towards a new online course called 321. It's an introduction to Christianity that's imaginative, thoughtful, engaging. It assumes absolutely no prior knowledge. It's presented by the wonderful Glenn Scrivener, who has been a guest on the MMM podcast previously, and I've also been a guest on his show. Glenn presents 8 video-led sessions which are based around some beautiful animated stories that illustrate the Christian message. You can check it out for free at 321course.com/MMM. Just enter your email, choose a password, and you're in. There's no spam, there's no fees. Just visit 321course.com/MMM. And now onto the show. Catherine, as soon as I heard about the premise of your book, I thought, this is amazing. This is like perfect podcast book to talk about. Describe briefly, what are the qualities that unite the women that you've interviewed for this book?
It will not be lost on you that the title of this book is not women with huge families, right? So what I tried to do is paint a picture of what it would look like. We're living through this phase, your work and others, of recognizing that there's a lifestyle we reject. It's a kind of lifestyle and philosophy of ideas that we reject. So I thought, well, what's a picture of what we're for? What's a picture of what's possible of a different life? And so as I worked through interviewing so many women who live this other lifestyle, right? It's fair to say they maybe rejected the sexual revolution. It's fair to say that they take a different approach to life, that they reject a whole bunch of types of things we now consider the orthodoxy of modern life. But what are they for? And it took me a long time to kind of zero in on that. And this is another way of asking, what do they have in common? What unites them? And I finally, after years of struggling with these testimonies, I thought, well, what they have in common is that they view children as valuable in themselves. It's valuable in themselves, and not merely for what the children might bring to them, right? So childbearing viewed as something to pursue for its own sake, right? And I thought, well, the biblical Hannah might be the single best mental image that I could provide of what that looks like, which isn't to say that everybody in my research presented herself to me as somebody who was praying about Hannah or identifying with the Hebrew scriptures, but no, like, what does it look like to sort of see children as worthy of pursuit for their own sake? And so I thought that's what united them, and that was kind of a central theme. That's hard to describe in a world where we've really lost that idea, right? That what you do, what it means to be an adult woman, is you look for ways in which you can welcome and nurture children, right? Like that's like the whole identity of your life. So for me, that was the sort of unifying theme. And of course, that takes on a lot of different personalities in the book.
So these are women who are bucking this enormous global demographic trend. Women who are educated. Has everyone been to university? Was that a
Yes,
yeah?
in this particular study, yes.
Right. So graduates living in the West, living in America. Is everyone in America?
Yes, in this research, yeah,
Yeah.
everybody in the States.
And
Yeah.
nevertheless are having 5 or more children, which is so rare. I mean, I do know actually quite a few women who are like this because I
Yeah.
guess I've got to know them professionally or through shared interests. But in general, these are really vanishingly rare women, and your book does really beautifully in-depth interviews with them to try and work out what exactly is why they have made this eccentric choice.
Yes, exactly. Why did they make this eccentric choice is a great way to put it. I mean, so at the beginning when I pitched this project, I said I'd really like to find out, why they're doing what they're doing and what they think it means, right? So motive, what are their motives and what do they think it means? What does it mean in a society where the typical family has 1.6 children to be the type of person who has 10? I mean, what does that mean? so so that was a big piece of this. Yeah. And why would you do this? I was a little bit concerned that when people think about that kind of family, they may have seen it once or twice. My interlocutors in the secular university, they may have heard about some religious family someplace, and they maybe think about Hasidism or some kind of, Jewish orthodoxy. Maybe they think of Mormonism from 30 years ago, although they think it's current, but they think of some kind of religious stereotype. And I thought, well, that risks missing what's going on, right? Is this some kind of like religious brainwash behavior? I didn't think so based on the people that I knew. And I wondered if we can understand motive, if we could dig into that, then we would have an answer to whether or not these women and these families are important for thinking about the moment that we're in, right? The moment that we're in, trying to reevaluate, reassess the legacy of feminism, the legacy of the sexual revolution. And digging in a little bit, I discovered, well, actually, that slice of the population, at least in the States, it's small. It's about 5%, but it's not continuing to diminish. It's been relatively stable for the last couple of decades, and perhaps it will grow a little bit. Certainly, they're having a lot of children. So if they manage to pass on a way of life or philosophy of life to some of their children, it may grow. But that's, it remains to be seen.
So sorry, is that 5% people who are having 5 children or more, or graduates who are having 5 children or more?
It's that 5% is of everybody.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
All of any given cohort of women like my age, about 5% will have 5 or more children.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it can be quite. I was actually just discussing this with a demographer friend this morning. This trying to get fine grained detail on fertility. I think maybe it's easier to come by in the US, but in Britain at least, it's quite hard to come by. You can get it based on things like ethnicity and age group and
Mm-hmm.
foreign born and things like that. But it's quite hard to get it based on precise level of education,
That's
precise
exactly right.
things like that. The
That's
impression
right.
that I get, at least
Mm-hmm.
in London where we live now, is that we have like South Korean levels of fertility, I think, among like graduates living in London. And I'm sure that's true in pockets of the States as well. So these women are bucking the trend even more. I mean, basically,
Yes.
to put it
Yes.
plainly, there's a strong
Yes.
correlation between women going to university and women having small families or not having children at all.
Yeah, I mean, so people have asked me why are you focusing on college educated women? I mean, are you making some judgment against people who don't have college educations? I mean, absolutely not. I'm not interested in doing that. But why? Because the global correlation, right? This is a global phenomenon. It's happening everywhere. The global correlation is the more education you have, the fewer children you have, right? Um, now, I don't think that's causal in the way that we typically think about causality. It's not. But what are the mechanisms by which that correlation um, plays itself out? So I talk about some of those things in the book. But I thought, I have limited resources, and this project took a long time as it was. So just to begin this contour, as you will, kind of this presenting this picture, I thought, well, let's start with the in a sense, most educated women who provide an example of what it looks like to do something different, to live a different life as possible. And I mean, in a sense, and to contrast what's in this book and these detailed interviews with these kind of, I don't know, like this, again, this moment we're in now with this kind of like bizarre internet culture of the trad wives and these other sorts of, like, I'm not interested in sort of, I really wanted to get a real picture of the inner motives, not what this looks like in terms of these images of, maybe certain kinds of baking or certain kinds of, stay at home or working, but really trying to get into the inner motives. Yeah. And to get outside of that box. Now, because these women are college educated, they're quite articulate, right? So, I mean, that strikes you as you go through the book. So in terms of interviewing folks, that worked out well. So, yeah.
Okay, so starting with thinking about some of these inner motivations, I found it very striking what a large proportion of the women you spoke to were religious. I can't be sure off the top of my head what proportion. I mean, what do you know what proportion roughly?
In my sample, religious, 98%.
Yeah, basically everyone.
Yeah, basically everyone. And as you saw, I mean, I included my best counterexample, right? Because it's very important for my argument that that it's not religion per se, but it's the content of religion, right? And so not all religion, the content of the particular faiths that these women live. And so my counterexample, the least religious woman that I interviewed, she becomes really important for unpacking that. Yeah.
Do you want to talk more about your counterexample as maybe the exception that proves the rule?
Yes, she's wonderful. I mean, they're all wonderful. I enjoyed these interviews so much. Uh, Lauren is my counterexample, and she has a great story. And she says, "Well, what were her motives?" And her motive was that that her husband wanted 9 children. So, and she doesn't have a great explanation for it. She and her husband are Jewish. They keep a Jewish household. But they're not, what you would maybe from the outside consider terribly devout. And I'm not, putting down her faith. They identify as Jewish, but she says to me right away at the beginning of the interview, the having 5 children, which they had 5 at the time of the interview, the having 5 children is distinct from the Jewish part. Like these are 2 separate pieces of our lives. Whereas nobody else that I talked to probably would have said that, would have presented a clean distinction. And so, of course, my job as a researcher is to take her at her word. She more or less laughed off the idea that children are blessings. But she's great. But her husband really wanted 9 children. And so she has a very humorous way of talking about how, after 1, it was the second. But she says, well, I don't know if it was hormones or something that, my husband wanted 9 and that wasn't going to be a problem for me. And so when I interviewed her, she has 5. And we don't know the end of the story. We don't know if she ends up having 6 or 7 or 8. But what I argue in her chapter is that it helped me to see that that what I found over and over in these interviews is that there's some positive description of value that people are moving towards. So she has 5 children at the time of the interview, not because she wants them, but because her husband wants them, and it's something she understands she can do for him. We press her on this, like, well, why really? Like, I mean, if you just would have stopped at 3, which is what she says, like, why really? And she says, well, he has everything else that he wants. I mean, he has a great job. They're very successful. She says, at the end of the day, this is what I can give to him. So it has all this value. I call it relationship value. It has all this value for her because this is something that he wants. Now, we know that it's incredibly rare today for a woman to be married to a man who wants 9 children. That's incredibly rare. But that's the source of value that she's moving towards, right? It's not a sense of, God is engaged in the creation of the world and that God thinks children are wonderful and that my own heart has been shaped by God's image of the world and the goodness of the world, which I heard from so many other people. But it was this very, I think, really charming and straightforward. My husband loves this. he can't wait till we have a whole house full of these babies. And so I thought, okay, that's the thing, right? It's always this kind of very simple, I mean, I think easy to understand. The benefits outweigh the costs, but not costs and benefits assessed in sort of mere economic terms, relationship terms, lifestyle terms, right? So for her, it was, in a sense, relationship terms provided so much value as to get her past that, that barrier of 4, 5, 6 children. And that really stood out. So I thought, okay, wait a second. I could go back and I can look at these religious stories and I can see that same depiction of some very precious kind of value, right? So there's a value here. And the reason I presented these in the context of what we call motive is I would say these are the kinds of things that got people thinking at the beginning, maybe I'd like to have more. I'm open to having more than, my neighbor next door. Some very clear articulation that this is an activity worth doing. I separated the motive in that sense, the clear conception of the value of children for relationship, for spirituality, for a good life, right? I separated that from kind of what keeps people going, because very often those things were slightly different. And so even Lauren, who begins with I'm doing this for my husband, she starts to articulate, oh, but there's so much goodness in this life. And as she starts to experience it, that and lots of the other women said the same thing. I got going for maybe idealistic reasons. We had principles we believed in, that this is what our marriage was for instance. But as we kept going, my goodness, I just fell in love with babies. Or as we kept going, I just saw how much joy this brought. So what gets you from 5 to 10 if you have time? Those are these outliers. Even in my sample, they're the outliers. What gets you there? Well, what gets you there is, after you've gotten started out of reasons of principle, you just discover there are these hidden rewards in this life. And if you still have time, boy, you just get one more. You ask for one more. And that was that was to me kind of the surprising part of this.
And how did the women tend to think about politics and about feminism? Because Lauren's comment there, particularly about wanting to please her husband by giving him so many children, that's a very countercultural thing to say, right? At least in more sort of liberal feminist circles. How did your interviewees tend to relate to that as a question?
That's a great question. Of course, I didn't go in with a set of interview questions about politics or ideology, but it came up. I mean, so I think at one point I say that they don't mention politics much at all or philosophy, except occasionally they say feminism. I mean, so, and typically in a pejorative fashion. So at some point I asked them, well, why do you think other women don't do what you do? So I wanted to get their sense of why their lifestyle choices were so uncommon. Not that we're not full of theories about that, and not that the women's ideas wouldn't be their own theories in a sense, but I thought it was very interesting. And so many of them said, oh gosh, I think it is feminism. I think it's this idea that a woman can't be fulfilled or isn't fulfilled without a kind of career or some kind of more male-coded way of life. So many of them brought that up. But there's another part of your question, which I think is very interesting, and I should mention it because we were just talking about Lauren, who speaks about having a lot of children as a way of giving something to her husband that he wants. And that language, I would say, was very interesting to me. And in the context of this big demographic question, I want to say that a topic that's been really underexplored by academics, so we say demographers and academics, is the extent to which the patterns we see aren't in fact women giving men what they want, in a sense, right? So in one sense, we can say, okay, well, Lauren's husband wanted 9, and that's a neat thing. It's an unusual thing. Well, how many children do men typically want, right? So we don't know the answer to that. It's very interesting. So a feature of the sort of feminist nature of, I would say, research in the academy in the last 40 or 50 years is that a lot of this research has kind of assumed that the number of children that are born is just exactly the number of children that women want. Right. So the feminist approach to maybe some of these questions actually kind of bakes in an assumption that we don't know if it's true or not. And it's funny. It's a curious assumption. It's an assumption that is exactly not what feminists have tended to think. Feminists have tended to think that women are kind of ruled by the patriarchy and told, right. I actually tend to think there's something pretty natural about looking to please your partner. I think that's something that whether we want to or not, we often do. I think we as women, I think it's, and that of course can be good and it can be terribly bad if our partners are not men of character, right? And so in fact, when we sort of hear these ideas like women maybe who say, I'd like to have had more children, but I got less than I wanted, we know that there's something to this story right now. To what extent are women dealing with partners who don't want as many children as they would want? And we don't, amazing, we just don't know the answer to that. So that's a long way of answering your question. In general, the women did think that some kind of version of feminism was part of the story of women not sort of setting out to make their lives. We'll just, so again, it's not rejecting a career. It's like not setting out to make your life flexible in the kind of way that you could welcome children. So that seemed to be sort of the theme. And so a lot of them blamed feminism for that. And so, yeah, so right, there's a lot to unpack there.
Yes, it's an interesting point that I have often, it's something that comes up quite often in the discussion around birth rates, at least in more recently, is that there is this gap between the number of children women say they would like and the actual birth rate. And there's obviously a lot of speculation about why that might be. Is it because of impediments to finding the right partner, economic impediments, right, whatever? Is it a revealed preference, maybe, that people say they want more children generally than they actually do? And there obviously are enormous sacrifices involved in having children. Maybe people just actually, most women and men don't actually want to make those sacrifices. Definitely possible. But it's true, as you say, that I've never seen survey data on how many children men say they want, which does seem like a big oversight. I guess no one cares to ask them.
Yeah, I think, well, when I really earnestly looked for this kind of data, and it's clear that the let's say the demographers or the capital D, the experts or something, they've kind of noticed recently that probably they should have thought about this. And so just recently you're starting to see some discussion of like, oh, well, we're going to look at men's completed fertility as a different thing from women's completed fertility. But we don't really know. It seems that in the old days, like the old dark days that we look back, we say all those people where they didn't know what they were thinking. The assumption in those old days was kind of like, well, men always wanted lots of children, and it was this kind of like patriarchal thing. And women, of course, had these more nuanced and respectable ideas about how that was only part of who they were, but they had these other things. Women were people too, and all of this. But I couldn't find a lot of evidence for the idea that kind of the basic male position is to want lots of children. And so I think that's something that needs to be examined. To your point, I mean, I am a bit agnostic at the moment. I do think we're taking this kind of idea of women's desires to at face value too much, right? I mean, so if you interviewed a whole bunch of women about what kind of car they'd like to drive, I mean, you'd get something. And, if you interview a bunch of people about how much weight they would like to lose, I mean, everybody wants to lose weight.
What's your ideal dress size, right?
Exactly. I mean, but then if we did a study, we found out, well, everybody's like 2 sizes bigger than their ideal dress size. Would that be a big problem? And we say, well, I mean, maybe it is. I don't know. Or maybe people really like their favorite foods more than they like to fit into.
Right. Yeah. It's quite a good comparison.
And so once you put those two things in conflict, right? Like what I'd like to eat and what dress size I'd like to have. Well, it turns out we know now what you really want.
Right. And there are obviously things to say. I've been thinking about this as quite a good comparison to where you have this paradox, right? Where people will often say, and there's definitely some truth to this, that there are economic limits to how many children they want to have, and that if house prices were lower, if tax regimes were more family friendly, etc., they would have more. And there's definitely some truth to that. But then you also look at the global data and you see that the richer a country is, the fewer children people have on average. And I guess it's a parallel I've thought might work is to say it's like rich countries are obesogenic, right? Rich countries have a plentiful supply of cheap calories. People don't have to do as much exercise because they're not doing manual work, so the sort of the environment is obesogenic in the same way that the environment in rich countries is antinatalist. But within that, and it's also the case that it gets a bit complicated, but to some extent within countries, people's wealth determines their weight in that if you can afford personal trainers and fruit and vegetables, and there is also some truth to that. But in the end, it does basically come down to your own tolerance for trade-offs. Like, are you willing to be hungry? Right? Are you willing to make the sacrifices necessary to have a large family? And people vote with their feet.
I think that's well put. I mean, that's kind of where I am at the moment, kind of thinking about this. I mean, I appreciate that you just sort of mentioned, I mean, yes, we could call this the argument from common sense. I mean, the argument from common sense says, yes, there may be people who are constrained by, as you say, by house prices, constrained or nudged in the wrong direction by, tax problems. But it from common sense, right? We think, well, the world and individual country economic resources by any measure have exploded in the positive direction. And the wealthier we get, the fewer children we choose. It's not a resource constraint problem, right? I mean, not in the global sense. I mean, I like to think, because look, having children it's really difficult to do this. I mean, I'd like to think maybe a way of thinking about it would be running a marathon, which I never hope to do and I don't have any desire to do.
That's what pregnancy is like, though. You ever seen those figures on like the amount of endurance demanded of your heart and lungs in late pregnancy really is like running a marathon.
I think that's exactly right. Yeah. I mean, and that's just the 24 hours around giving birth. Mm-hmm. And then, you think about 18 more years minimally. I mean, so it's like if you thought, well, look, I mean, if you learned, and this is probably not true, but suppose you learned that as people got wealthier, they ran less marathons. And you thought, well, what we really need to do is kind of make it possible for people to run marathons. Let's give them all sneakers, right? Let's give them all sneakers. Like, what do you mean? They don't have sneakers? I mean, they're very wealthy people. Well, they don't have the right sneakers, or the right sneakers are hard to find. And you could go around and helicopter drop, bags of the right sneakers to people. Are you going to get more marathon running? Well, I mean,
maybe a little bit.
You're maybe a little bit on the margin. Maybe there was somebody out there who didn't know that a shoe could be this comfortable. But really, you aren't going to have more marathon running because not that many people want to run marathons. And that's, so this, I mean, like economists would say this is like a demand story. So this is kind of question of what do people really want and why do they want it?
What really stood out to me actually in reading your interviews and thinking about this economic question is there were some, I mean, you mentioned that Lauren's husband is professionally successful, so they maybe do have more resources to put into this project, but that's not true of all of your interviewers at all. And often people are being really thrifty and it's difficult. It's not as if they necessarily have copious amounts of social support or family support or money. Not at all. Like, it is difficult. And I can't remember her name now, but there was one woman who named one of her children. He was born at a really difficult time and it was just really difficult for them. And they named him in recognition of that. But now I've forgotten the name. Right. Can you remember?
I think that was Amanda. I think she said the middle name was Atlas.
Right, yes.
She felt that the weight of the world was on their shoulders when they had him.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because it would be easy to assume that these outlier big families are in some sense materially much more blessed than everyone else, but they're not. They're spiritually more blessed, it seems.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah. So one way to think about the project was to go around and find out, what makes it possible for people to be different. And what I didn't find was, here's a group of women who have lower costs to having children, or who articulate, it's easy for me, or it's easy for me, or it's possible for me, even though within my sample, I did meet people, in Lauren's case, they're very successful. successful enough that I can't say what city they live in because, you could figure out who they were. They're very successful. So she says, well, at some point she says to her husband, well, we need to get more help at home, and they get help. I don't know what that involved. But yeah, of course, I talked with women who had at different times been on government support for food. I talked to people clearly living paycheck to paycheck, and that was part of the project, was to present these different ways that this could end up being something you could choose and be happy with. The couple in the Rocky Mountains in the first chapter, um, they say, well, yeah, we just we get everything secondhand, and we drive secondhand cars, and we always we don't have to spend very much money.
What proportion of the women would you say are stay-at-home moms? Because that's the big financial cost, right? The loss of one income.
Yes.
It's not the clothes
Yes.
and the cars, it's the loss of one income.
That's right. So, as you said earlier, I don't have detailed sort of population level data on that, but in my sample, was probably less than half. It was probably about 40%. So I did have a robust group that still worked full time. And then there was this broad middle of people who did a little bit of part-time work here and there, many from home, some of them not exclusively from home. And then, yeah, maybe 30 or 40% were exclusively stay-at-home moms. I did have this one story, which I thought important to include. She worked as a pediatrician, and her husband stayed home full time. So I mean, this wasn't the diversity move here, kind of like you could have a stay-at-home dad, but I thought it was important to present all the ways that this worked out.
And did you interview him as well?
No, I didn't interview any of the dads. So a lot of people have said, "Is that your next project?" I said, "Well, maybe, but I'll have to get a dad interviewer."
How did they make it work in their family, having the stay-at-home dad? Because that is the unusual model.
Very unusual. So when they started out, they both worked. He worked full time, and she worked. I don't know if she worked a little bit full time at the beginning, but as a pretty successful pediatrician, they figured out pretty quickly that she could work part time. I mean, I think it was like 3 days a week or 2.5 long days a week, maybe 10-hour or 12-hour days. And so he was working full time and she was working part time as a pediatrician. And then it kind of became clear to them. I mean, he didn't love his work, and he really did love, spending time around the house and the other types of support things he could do. And she really did love her work. She feels that it's a very deep and important part of who she is. She thinks of it as very similar to her work as a mother. She's a healer. And so they realized they could support themselves if she put a little bit more time in and he stayed home. And that's what they did. When they interviewed her, most of her children were older. And so she was out of the little years with the toddlers and the little ones. But it seemed like it worked out well. Her husband played a lot of golf. That was clear, which we chuckled over. My husband's a golfer. So that, yeah, it seemed harmless. I mean, it didn't seem like a big problem for the, or I don't know, biblical femininity or the things we're discussing now, again, in these kind of weird online discussions. Yeah, it seemed like they were very happy.
And how generally did the full-time working mums manage? Because I've seen the data on this, like, increased anxiety and depression among full-time working mothers compared with stay-at-home moms and part-time moms. So it's like objectively the more difficult route.
It is objectively the more difficult route. And you see that coming out in the interviews. You see, I think Angela, who is a full-time professor, she's in the second half of the book, and she says, well, she says, look at me, I'm not a picture of self-care. She said, if this was sort of the ideal, I look awful, she says. And she's joking. She has a great sense of humor. But of course, yeah, she says at some point, well, I wish we'd had more. And she says, why do we only have 5? We would have wanted 10. And she says, well, it's the job. It's the being on the tenure track. It's the stress of that. So I think that they were frank in the discussions of the stress and the difficulty. And generally in my sample, I have to think if I have that added up, but the women who did work full time, they were not at the higher end of the number of children. Yes, so you do see that trade off in the number of children, whereas I have the women with 10 or 12.
Yeah, that's just a lot of
Children.
mat leave. I mean, if you're having 10, if you're
Yes,
having 10
exactly.
children in a, I
Yes,
mean,
that's
absolute
right.
max 20-year period, right?
That's right. And
That's like
so
alternating 1 year mat leave and 1 year at work. Like that just becomes
exactly,
almost impossible.
exactly.
Yeah.
No, that's exactly right. And I think it's important to sort of show that. I mean, in a sense, I mean, the proposition is kind of like, look, I mean, to have a stabilized birth rate in society, it we we, we don't need to have everybody having 10 children, right? I mean, we just need to have a little bit more openness to children than we have. We need to see it possible that women could prioritize family from the beginning of their careers. And so everybody that I met in this group, they had done that, but in different ways. So the women who'd leaned into career more than others, they tended to have started their families later and had fewer children. But you see, like, well, it can work out. You can get married at 30 and have 3 or 4 children, or 5, just sneak that last one in at 42. Um, yeah, but you see the trade-off in terms of work time and children even in this samples. You see that at play. But what we see, like, in generally in society, is that whole window of children is much more it's shifted down. So the career women are having 1, and the stay-at-home moms might have 2 or 3, right? It's like we need to shift the norm up, right, to get to sustainable population.
I mean, or what seems like a very likely route is that whatever genes these women have, which are driving them towards having big families, are currently being selected for very hard. And so we should expect the next generation or two and more to have, whatever. Well, religiosity is one thing. Probably stoicism. I mean, I was going to ask, do you think that these women are more likely to have easier pregnancies, or what, did you not know, or did you not discuss it, or did you not notice a pattern? Things like morning sickness.
Yeah, I did not notice a pattern, actually. I met and talked with people who had all manner of terrible and easy experiences. Women who battled mental health problems. Yeah, so I didn't notice a pattern in terms of it being easier to have children physically, in terms of the quality. Although, again, I mean, maybe this is, and I'm just going to contradict myself. It's true that the woman who had 10 or had just was about to have her 10th, I mean, she said, well, for me, it's been physically uncomplicated. I've had relatively easy pregnancies. So maybe there was in that sense. But in terms of the future, I mean, you say, like, well, whatever's in these women, we might also want to think about the nurturing part. I mean, the nature part you mentioned in their genes, but the nurturing part. So something I've noticed, just as my children are just now getting to the age of getting married, is how much the experience of having little ones around when they were growing up has oriented them to this is a great thing. This is a thing to look forward to, not a thing to be afraid of. This is the kind of knowledge of the experience of children, which I think people are really lacking, right? So we have a grown adult members of the species who go into the hospital and have a baby, and it's the first time they've held a baby.
Mm. Yeah,
I mean, that's
surprisingly
a very
common. Yeah.
strange thing, right? It's just like it's a very strange thing for a species of any type. I always scratch my head about this. But I mean, so my son is 20, was married in last summer at the age of just shy of turning 20. He was 19. He married a girl from a family of 15. She's the second of 15. And they just couldn't wait to get married and have children. It was like, how soon are we allowed to do this? And I'm not trying to say, I mean, for them, of course, they're both religious. But for them, I would say you wouldn't, if you interviewed them, get a sense that, well, this was because they were very devout or religious. They just thought babies were the best because they grew up with these babies. And so they were wanting to know when do we have permission to get married and have it's like the best thing you could do. So they are having a baby, God willing, in April. They're expecting. But for me, watching them was really clear. Like, well, if teenagers don't grow up around babies ever, and young women go to college, university, they've never held a baby, they've never gotten past the initial shock of like, yeah, this baby's really needy, right? That initial shock is you need to eat every 2 hours. That's amazing. But what happens is, 3 months into that, you've been feeding this baby every 2 hours. And the relationship that emerges, the gratitude of that baby just worships you, right? So we've got all of these people running around, first of all, who have no idea that feeding somebody every 2 hours is a terribly rewarding thing to do. And then they don't have any concrete experience of that. So how are they supposed to think when they're 20 or 21, like, this is really high on my list of things I want to accomplish in the next 10 years? It's like just an absence of knowledge.
In the UK, when there was this worry about teen pregnancy rates among single mums being very high in like the 90s, those have since plummeted. I think the leading theory as to why they've plummeted is because of the introduction of long-acting reversible contraceptives and lots of teenage girls getting onto those. But anyway, this was at the period where there was a lot of concern over this in government, and there were these schemes to expose teenage girls who were considered at risk to spend time with young children, so like to volunteer in daycare centers and things. The idea being that they would realize, oh, actually babies are really hard work, you don't want this. And it very reliably caused an increase in teen pregnancy among those exact girls, because actually it turns out that young women like babies and being exposed to babies actually reminded them how nice babies are. I was just thinking about the economic question as well. You're talking about the normalisation of big families. This is a really big factor in these economic questions when people are considering the trade-offs to having children at all or having larger families. When everyone around you, if you're in a peer group where people don't have big families, then what you consider to be an aspirational level of affluence is going to be influenced by that. So when you think, oh gosh, it's so expensive, or oh gosh, our quality of life is so reduced by having children, what you're doing is you're comparing your quality of life with your friends who don't have kids or with your friends who only have one. And so, of course, relatively, you are going to feel poorer. But if all of your peer group were also having big families, you wouldn't feel relatively poorer. And things like the expectation that like every child will have their own bedroom. I assume these families with 10 kids, they are not living in 11-bedroom houses, right? I presume that people just don't think that that's a normal thing to expect when you're in that kind of culture, or it's just become normal to you to have a big family.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, this kind of question of how birth rates started to fall, but then they continue to fall, right? So what we're kind of looking for now, a lot of people, is like what makes the cycle keep going, right? And I think the types of things you're highlighting, you sort of shift to this place where, something I like to talk about is the shift to kind of quality over quantity. I mean, not to put it so I don't know, so bluntly. I mean, right? I don't think people think they're after quality children, right? But it's what you said. I mean, it's like what does it mean to have a child in the right way? Right, in the right way. Well, it's like their own bedroom and all this kind of thing. So what happens first, you have maybe a shift where, everybody decides to get on the pill so they can, get their career squared away or whatever that is. But you start to shift to this, like, when's the right time and what's the right number and this kind of right. I mean, like, what's right? And then in the next generation, right is now informed by what everybody else has been doing. Right. And then that sort of, it's like a vicious cycle that just keeps driving the number down. It's like there's like when I was a kid, right? It was one set of things, and now it's amazing, right? The things that were considered like the right things to give your kids, right? It was great if you had a bicycle in high school where I was. I mean, I remember that. But when I look in my current neighborhood, my neighbor across the street actually has 4 children. We moved in and I thought that was really crazy, or amazing to meet somebody with 4 children. and they're pretty successful. But, every one of those 4 children, well, the first 3 that can drive, they all have a car. Everyone has a car. And the mom has a car, and dad has a car. You think, like, well, that's not really a terribly easy thing to accomplish, right? But, I really remember, like, the big thing when I was a kid was, like, we all had a bike, but this is what you're saying is kind of like this ratcheting up of what's the right type of life for a child to have.
Yeah. Like it reminded me of a friend who was saying recently that his wife would like to have 4 children. They have one so far, and but he was concerned that if they had that many, they wouldn't be able to give them a big lump sum towards a deposit on a house.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, which is like clearly true, but
Yeah.
also just shows I mean, obviously we're talking about house prices in London being extremely high, so that
Yeah.
the implicit thing was
Yeah.
we wouldn't be able to give them access to the London
Yeah.
housing market in the way that we have. Yeah, like that's the sort of thing. If that's your standard of um, the material conditions you're going to give your children, then of course you will have to limit how many you can have.
It was clear that in the thought process of many of the women I interviewed, they had gotten used to thinking of the other things they were giving their children. Maybe in part to soothe maybe the twinge of guilt that their children didn't have this or that. But they talked a lot about how great it was that their children had the opportunity to be responsible for other people, for instance. They were able, without contriving it, to give their children more responsibility. They were able to give their children siblings. I mean, the gift of a network of other people who care about you and can help you and go to bat for you, and how important that is. So we did hear a lot of that kind of language. Well, we can't give our children, this, but we can give them this. And that seemed to me to be kind of a kind of a healthy thought pattern. I mean, it's a healthy thought pattern in general, right? It's a way that people can develop resilience in life. You can't have this, but like focus on what you can do. So it strikes me now, given your question, that's something that we can help people overcome, right? It's like, well, you're, as you point out, you are exactly right. You can't have 4 children and give them all a lump sum towards a house, but you can give them this other thing, which might be just as good, or maybe it's better.
Yeah, and that might mean, if you live in an expensive housing area, which not only means that it's hard for you to afford a house, it's also hard for your children to afford a house. Maybe that means you have to move somewhere cheaper. And I guess these are the sort of trade-offs that the women in your study were willing to make, but that lots of people aren't willing to make. And that's basically when it comes down to, what are you willing to tolerate to have this?
What are you willing to give up?
Yeah,
That's right.
The episode is not over. There is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road. Allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.